All right, well, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. This is Cheryl Fries, and I'll be coordinating the webinar this morning. I am down on the Willamette National Forest with the Central Cascades Adaptive Management Partnership. I'm helping out the Region 6 Ecology Group with their tech transfer for this year. This morning we have a webinar, probably be about an hour. Well, we'll be talking about evaluating forest structure and restoration needs. And Tom DeMayo, the regional ecologist for Region 6, will be giving the presentation, and Ryan Haugo will be offering support from the Nature Conservancy, sorry. So if you're just signing on, well, if you can't hear me, it means you haven't dialed the phone number. So you need to dial the phone number on your screen or have somebody tell you to do that and enter the passcode to get the audio. Please mute your phone, otherwise everybody will be able to hear everything you do. So hit mute or *6. And the way we're going to run questions is please type them into the question and answer box that'll come up, that's up there on your screen in the middle, and we'll address those questions at the end of the talk. If you want more detailed discussions, if you want to stay on the line after the webinar is over, Tom and Ryan will be available for more lengthy discussions. And I think Tom is also available to come to units and give this presentation and have more thorough discussion as well. So with that, let me turn it over to Tom and Ryan.
Morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. We wanted to share results of a study to evaluate forest structure restoration needs across Oregon and Washington. This is a joint effort of the Nature Conservancy and the Forest Service here in the region. We recently published a paper in Forest Ecology and Management. It's been accepted and is in progress. And joining me on the call today are Ryan Haugo and Chris Sanger from the Nature Conservancy, and you can see the other co-authors there representing the regional office, the ecology program, and the east side restoration effort. So we all know that restoration has become our management paradigm in the Forest Service and arguably our top priority in the agency, and it's been a focus of our work in recent years. And it leads pretty quickly to the question of where do we make treatments, how much, and what kind of forest management. And the results of our study show that in fire-prone forests, so in other words, eastern Oregon and Washington and southwest Oregon, that almost 5 million acres of national forests are currently in need of thinning or prescribed burning. And we also have to remember that treatments are not the only approach to restoration, and that sometimes we do need to let areas grow into a different xeral stage. So our assessment showed that 3.6 million acres needed to grow and produce larger or more complex structure. So I'm going to take some time here and outline the methods that we used. We built on the body of fire regime condition class work that we've been implementing in the region since 2003. And if you recall, the early FRCC efforts were at landscape scale and could describe the departure from a sustainable range either as a continuum or in discrete classes of within the historic range, moderately departed, or severely departed. But we have over the years refined that method so that we can identify the number of actual acres needing restoration by xeral stage and by potential vegetation type and any watershed of interest. As I mentioned earlier, it's not only the treatments of thinning and prescribed burning or disturbance, but succession is sometimes needed to move watersheds towards a sustainable state. numbers of acres needing restoration, what types of restoration. And so we came together to have a partnership between the ecology program and the Nature Conservancy, because we felt it would be much stronger if, versus, different organizations using different analyses and different numbers, if we worked together and we had really a shared process and a shared outcome that we could all speak from the same page. And, yeah. That's right. Thanks, Ryan. That's a good point. So some of the inputs that we use in our work, when you do a fire regime condition class or an historic range of variability assessment, you need to use some concept of potential vegetation, because that sets the framework for describing that range of variation and what's possible. So in this study, we used the potential vegetation layer from ILAB, the Integrated Landscape Assessment project, which concluded a few years ago, and it's our current potential vegetation map. Although I should mention briefly that the ecologists are working on a new iteration of potential vegetation for the region, and hope to have that ready sometime in 2015. We used reference conditions from land fire in this study, because you need to model what that range of variation is for each potential vegetation type. So in other words, the mix of several stages and their relative abundance in the historic context. You need some kind of landscape delineation, so we used fifth field HUCs, or hydrologic unit capability. And for current vegetation, we used the gradient nearest neighbor layer, which is our standard existing vegetation layer at broad scale. We used the 2006 layer for this particular study, although the work has now been updated using the 2012 layer. So some of the improvements on this over previous efforts were the recently developed ILAB potential veg layer versus land fire biophysical settings. In land fire, that was an effort intended for national and some regional use. And the potential veg layer in that we felt could be improved on, so we used the ILAB layer for that. I think a major improvement that Kim McLean and others worked on were better identifying the size classes, particularly on the east side, because the work that had been done in GNN used quadratic mean diameter, which works fairly well on the west side, but less so for the east side. So there were some improved descriptions of size classes, which make this an improved product. Then that could be tied into gradient nearest neighbor, the third point there. There was a better assignment of the state transition model to potential vegetation type. And then a significant improvement, which we'll go into, are not only did we identify the acres in each several states that needed to be either treated followed by succession or succession only, but the sequence they needed to occur in. So because of this, you can tell pretty quickly what kind of effort is needed in each watershed and plan accordingly. Sometimes it's a relatively easy single entry or two entries, and other times it's a rather complex sequence that may give you pause in your landscape planning. And I have to give credit to Ryan here, who did most of the work on determining that sequence process. So you may have seen this slide before. These next diagrams were developed by Ann Schlitzky just to illustrate the idea of describing the successional classes, which you see along the x-axis there, and then the relative abundance. And this is determined, those relative abundances are determined through state transition modeling based on historic records from tree review analysis and other work. So we have a sense of what the range of each of those abundances was historically. are seriously deficient, and at the late serial close, you're somewhat above historic range. This is just a hypothetical example, but it is fairly typical of a lot of areas in eastern Oregon and Washington. And the Nichols conifer, for example.
Hey, Tom, this is Cheryl. Your voice is a little bit garbled, not just for me, but also down in Roseburg. So maybe stepping away from the mic a little bit, or I'm not sure what kind of phone you're using, but...
Okay, I'm using the tabletop phone, and I'm about 2 feet away from the... Is that any better?
No, you're still actually kind of garbled.
Okay, I guess I can just, vary the distance. It could be something in the phone line that we don't have control over.
Right. Keep going for a little bit. We'll see if it evens out. Otherwise, we might have you hang up and call back in.
Okay, let's do that. If it continues to be a problem, I'll just hang up the dial again. So continuing with this line of thought on the departure from the historic range, because we have an estimate of what those historic ranges were, and we know where we are now, we can make plans about what to do with it. So in the early serial stage here, for example, you would just need to let that grow over time, so a succession approach. In the mid-serial close, you would need to remove takers by treating them, by thinning them out, and making them into mid-serial open, or you could treat them and then let them grow into late serial open. And obviously, in the late serial open, we need much more of that. But that's only going to be achieved in this particular case through setting the mid-serial close and then letting it grow into late serial open eventually. How are we doing on sound quality?
I think it's starting to even out for some reason. The big bird must have flown off the line.
Okay.
Keep going.
Okay, so again, to just emphasize this point, which is important, is that in moving these landscapes towards an historic range, sometimes disturbance only through thinning, prescribed burning, or use of wildfire is the appropriate approach. Sometimes you just need to wait, succession only, let it grow back. And then at other times, as in the previous example, it's more complex. You might need to disturb it, say, thin out your mid-serial close, and then let it grow into an older serial stage. So one of the obvious results of this work is that a substantial increase in activity is needed pretty much everywhere, although those amounts vary. You can see here we've displayed the restoration need by subregion. On the x-axis there, dividing the region into about 7 subregions, and then the acre need. So for example, in the Oregon Blue Mountains, there's a need for active treatment for about 1.7 million acres. The Oregon Southeast and Washington Columbia Basin are so little because those are primarily non-forest areas.
Actually, Tom, I'll make one quick clarification there. Looking at this graph, it's the red and the purple bars. The red bars are the conditions where it's, a disturbance today alone can put stands back into the condition they need for their natural range variability. The purple are where disturbance is needed, then time to grow. Adding together those two bars represent the disturbance or the active restoration needs that we have on our landscape today. The combination.
That's right. Thanks for that clarification. And you'll those on the line, you'll see that there's some complexity in the sequence that you have to do that.
What does disturbance only mean? So that's a situation where, actually, Tom, I'm going to flip it back to, I'm going the wrong way, sorry. So in this example where we have certain successional classes that are overabundant, in this case it is the mid-open and slightly of the late open these mid-closed acres would need to be moved into the late open condition, and that's where that would call for a thinning or fire today to open the canopy, but then it will take additional time to grow the larger, older structure necessary to classify as a late open. Does that make sense?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. Here, Tom, we'll get us back to where we were. Oh, okay.
Okay. So this slide, this graph illustrates the point we made earlier about almost 5 million acres of national forest land in this study area needing thinning and or burning. And conversely, about 3.6 million acres needed to take the succession approach of waiting and letting them grow into larger or older structure. So here's another illustration of this showing only a national forest. The previous ones were all in. And here's another way of looking at by individual national forest. And you can see the relative amounts of those three approaches vary, but the need for some form of disturbance is pretty substantial everywhere. So we can ask the question of what is driving these patterns. You can see the two maps here, the disturbance restoration need on the left, and then the succession need on the right. And we want to stress, that this is an integrated study and that you need to consider the different seral stages and the sequence in which they would receive a treatment or succession. So we're cautioning people against looking at a map quickly and rushing to a conclusion. So, go ahead, Ryan.
Well, I was going to say, you might say that these maps, the map on the left represents both of those disturbance categories, the disturbance only, disturbance and succession. It's being mapped as sealed watersheds, and the colors represent acres of disturbance need as a proportion of total forest acres within a watershed. And then this includes all forest ownerships, not just federal forests. And then similarly, the map on the right is showing as a percentage of forests within a thin field watershed, the numbers of acres falling into the disturbance and succession or succession only. So the total numbers of acres that we've identified as needing succession as part of the process to return to NRD.
Right. And so, for example, if you look at the Oregon Blue Mountains, we don't want people to, rush to a conclusion that no treatment is needed in the northern part of the area because there is still a substantial need for treatment. It's just this is presented on a relative basis as a percentage of the watershed. We can also talk about what this might mean for individual forests. And you can see the hatching there is the national forest land.
But the hatching is the restricted management areas, such as wilderness and roadland. And this map has been shaded out, so this is only displaying national forest land.
Okay, thank you.
With the colors. Yeah.
So we can see how, if we wanted to look at this by fire regime groups, which relate to the frequency and severity of fires historically. So fire regime group 1 is frequent low intensity, so you might think of Montrose Pine as an example. The fire regime group 3 is a mixed severity, and most of our mixed conifer is in that fire regime. And then fire regimes 4 and 5 are long interval but high severity. So these tend to be the cooler, wetter ecosystems which rarely burn, but because of the huge amount of biomass there, when they do burn, they burn very severely. So something like subalpine fir or
these cascades, we look at the watershed map, and it's like, boy, this is showing a relatively lower level of need for watershed. But here, this is really driven by the distribution of these forest types. So when we zoom into this region, and we look at the mixed conifer dry potential vegetation type, which is quite abundant here, within that drier PVC, nearly 50% of the acres are in need of disturbance today. So locally, those disturbance restoration needs can be very high. And it was simply that, along the East Cascade, that's such a rapid elevational and environmental gradient from lower to middle and higher elevations that within the watershed, as a proportion of watershed, the needs may be lower. But within the dry forest types here, disturbance needs are still quite high as they are across the region.
Go ahead.
Well, this is Karen Bennett, and that's exactly why I think we should display this by land type association and not watershed. I think watershed just washes out where the real need is.
Okay, well, we can explore doing that. I also want to point out the importance of ownership patterns and to think about the total landscape context in which lands fall. In various parts of the region, there's significant Bureau of Land Management areas such as Southwest Oregon, and in other areas such as the Washington East Cascades and the Washington Northeast, private land is a significant ownership. And so treatment actions should be planned in that content, that broader context. Again, perhaps there's, the influence of private lands in Northeast Washington and Southwest Oregon. A lot of the red on that map, Southwest Oregon, is a reflection of private industrial lands. There's also a significant Bureau of Land Management area down there, too. So this would be map of succession needs, and you can see relatively high need also to let areas grow into older cereal states. And remember, these things are not necessarily conflicting within a watershed. You may have some areas that you need to let grow, and you may have other areas you need to treat. So the results of this work are available, and we've illustrated the link there. I understand also this presentation is being recorded and will be made available online, but this presentation will be posted here. The paper in Forest Ecology and Management is already posted, and I believe Chris has some of the data up online as well, and we'll get the rest. In addition to the spatial displays, there are tabular results by watershed and forest type and by ownership that may be a useful planning tool.
And that was one of our big, I might jump in and say we're going to show what some of these results are, but one of our big motivations for this was not simply to make region-wide maps, but was to provide some information, some context, and so that when a planning team or a collaborative is looking at projects in individual watersheds, there's some background information available. How do you tie conditions and needs within that watershed into a larger regional context? And we're hoping that a lot of the background data that we're providing on the EcoShare site will give land managers some tools to do that with.
And here's just a quick illustration of some of these tabular results where you can see that by ownership, in this case, and subregion, the acres are tallied for disturbance. industry already. As we've said, we need a multi-ownership look at things. And then how do we track if management actions are meeting restoration needs? And I'll show you that in a moment. So this is some work that I presented to the silviculturist back in June, and I've been discussing with the forest gradually. So this is how you would use this information for a specific watershed and a specific vegetation type. So this is just one example, but it's an actual watershed on the east side of the Mount Hood in the mixed conifer dry, where you can see the several stages listed there in the first column, the early to late closed totals, and then the reference percent. So in other words, the historic estimate of what the abundance of that several stage was across the landscape. And by knowing the total area of the watershed, you can multiply those and get the reference acres. Then, based on your existing vegetation map, you know what the currents are. And so you can determine how many acres you are either in excess or deficit. Now, previous work we were able to show this, but I think the power of what Brian's done is we now can specify a certain sequence in the tree. So that's the action order in that column. So in the first treatment, you would take your late sterile closed and treat a portion of that. And then that would go into the late sterile open. So those are the two items marked with 1. So there's a removal action and a receiving action, if you will, for each of these activities. You can see that sequence there. As I work with the forest, I can, do some training and go through this in thorough detail. I'm not sure we need to do that today, each sequence step. But I'm thinking, for example, in doing your FRCC assessment, I think this is a more powerful way than the traditional landscape departure for your planning, because you can see what actual acres you need to do.
Hey, Tom, Ann Schliskey's got a good question. If she's there with you, or Ann, if you want to unmute and ask it, that'd be great.
Okay, yeah, I was typing. Well, I was just thinking about back on the first project of the Blue Mountains Restoration Team is the Lower Joseph project, and it has a really high proportion of the land in inventory growth areas. And that has become, it is a significant planning issue, what to do in those places, whether to do mechanical disturbance restoration versus staying out of those places and just letting more natural disturbances occur, but their current conditions, really call for restoration, and this analysis shows that. And so I was just thinking about it would be really useful, I think, to use this analysis as a tool to show those trade-offs of, either show those trade-offs for places that have high proportions of those kind of controversial areas relative to active or disturbance restoration, and what the risks are from an ecological perspective, because if we don't treat them there is a potential that, they're going to be knocked back to early sterile. And I just see that as a really, really useful, potentially useful use of this data.
Thanks. Yeah, we're willing to work with you however you like to try to. I think as you work through these examples, you can see pretty quickly which watersheds are going to require, a fairly complex and expensive approach, and what other ones might be relatively easy to work in, and that, I think, would certainly be a planning consideration as we move forward.
Tom, Amy Matheson has a good comment also about the controversy around hitting the closed late sterile first. Amy, you want to unmute?
Sure. We were having a discussion on the UMPLA for part of our veg management strategy, and we were looking at some of these
FRCC numbers, and I see that you've put this as action order 1, where the reference condition is 14% and the current condition is 21. And without knowing, for example, standard deviations or anything like that, one of my questions would be, is that 21% really a lot larger than historical conditions, or is it within perhaps the historical norms? Oh no, you've taken all my numbers away.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to go ahead.
And even so, having in the past this social context of having hit late sterile forest hard, I felt like that would be a difficult sell to make to some members of our public. Whereas some of these other areas where it looks like there is a significant difference, for example, the mid-sterile closed with a reference condition of 1% and a current condition of 35, which is similar to some of the numbers that we were seeing in some of our watersheds. Going from mid-sterile closed to mid-sterile open is something that you can change using active management, and then use succession to change like mid-open to late open or late closed. So I was just a question of the action order and some of the questions surrounding FRCC.
Right. Well, you may want to take that approach of saying the mid-sterile close first, but the only caution there is you have to think about the sequence order of these, and there's cascading effects. Sitting here right now, I don't know what the sequence would become if we started there. We could work through that. We certainly should, I think, in a real-world planning exercise, we certainly should work through that option. But just keep in mind that when you move the treatment order around, it can create bottlenecks and cascading effects that you may not be able to overcome.
Tom, can I jump in on this as well? I was just flipping the slides forward to say, I think one of the most important things to keep in mind with this analysis is that, these are not difficult prescriptions that what we're providing. And the logic of the treatment order was what we came up with, what could we apply in every, across this entire analysis. And there, we developed a logic order for each forest type. And so it's a different order for a ponderosa pine than for a silver fir type. But still, it's very generalized. And so I guess my thought would be, with the planning team, local context, local data is always incredibly important in developing, determining which stands to treat, whether it's a focus on active treatment in the mid-sterile first or in the late sterile close first. And so I think that local perspective and local context is always super important. I know up in Washington, at TNC, we've been doing a lot of work in Okanagan and Wenatchee using their forest restoration strategy. And I think that's just one, but I think that's a great process by how do you put landscape context, how do you design on-the-ground treatments with respect to landscape context. And I guess my hope is simply that this analysis that we're presenting here provides, ID teams with tools, information, and data to think about. And hopefully the order of treatment is something is useful. But I would never say that what we presented here from a region-wide perspective would trump or would dictate what somebody does locally, if that makes sense.
It makes sense, but I'm sure you could have heard the colorful debate that was going on around the table when we were discussing this stuff.
Yeah. Right, and that is certainly true. And, this is just one tool in your planning process. And, we want to emphasize that, we were looking at forest structure. We weren't looking at, aquatic needs or wildlife, or all those things need to be taken into consideration. So Ryan is absolutely right that this is not, a mandate for what you have to do. It's a tool. I was making the point that there is the ecological reality of the sequence order, and that has to be taken into consideration as well, because you could, for example, treat the mid-sterile close first, but then you might end up with an overabundance of mid-sterile open that you can't treat down the line and get to your sustainable technological reality that you also need to consider.
Tom and Ryan, Karen's got a question about the role of public lands. Want to ask that quick, Karen?
Yeah, I was really interested in the discussion a couple of slides ago about private land, and wondered if your team is discussed or is looking at or has the ability to look at the different management objectives of private industrial forest land versus federal land management, and the need for federal land to compensate from, the continued harvest and maintenance of that mid-sterile habitat on private industrial. What would we have to do differently if we were trying to compensate for that kind of treatment in order for us to maintain the kind of habitats that we need for sustainable, viable wildlife population?
That's right, and that's probably a more eloquent way of saying what I was getting at earlier about the full landscape context and considering other ownerships, is that in your landscape planning where you are considering all lands, that you might come to that exact point that you decide that the national forests have a certain role in preserving the lake zero, whereas the more active treatment happens on private land. Again, that's no mandate either, but I can see exactly what you're getting at.
And I would say that there was a really interesting conversation last month when all of the Washington collaborative groups got together about that very topic, about when we're collaborating and working on large landscape scale planning for restoration on public lands. It's oftentimes not a mystery what the management objectives might be for the adjacent or adjoining private lands, and like just as you said, how do you take that into account when making decisions about the public lands?
Very good. So, again, here, if you took this example, and if hypothetically you made all the treatments, you would end up with this so-called balanced, sustainable state. Now, in reality, would this ever happen? Probably not, because of all the constraints that we face, but it would show you at least what that sustainable state might look like. And then just note the comment there at the bottom that second action is going to require growing time. So, obviously taking a very long view on how all this is going to work. And Ryan had mentioned this already, but it certainly bears repeating, is that we are not dictating cultural prescriptions. If you have environmental data, absolutely you should use it. And this is just one consideration in your restoration planning. And bear in mind that updated information will continually change over time. We see this whole concept as a fairly dynamic process as we continually update layers, and of course trees grow, fires happen, so things are changing all the time.
Very fascinating webinar here. Would you like to listen?
Whoever just said that's a fascinating webinar, we appreciate that, but mute your phone.
Oh, yeah, I'm glad they weren't cursing us out. Maybe all those folks have theirs, but not me. Anyway, some of the next steps in the near future, we've worked really hard with the leadership of both organizations to do this right in a policy context. And there will be a formal joint press release in early November. Our Cheryl mentioned, I'm happy to visit the forest and talk about it. We will refine the maps over time as new data become available. Ryan and Chris have already updated it with the 2012 layer. And we do have plans to complete the region, the west side of the Cascade Crest. Our director, Jerry Ingersoll, is very interested in seeing that happen. And also in a larger context, there is a Northwest Land Area science synthesis in the early stages of development, and we're thinking we probably want to have this completed for that. So if there are any other questions or discussion, we have about 15 minutes here.
Ann Schliske had a question, Tom. Ann, go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, I was actually reflecting on, I think it was Amy's comment about the, the treatment of mid-soil clothes versus the late-soil systems, and at least with the collaboratives we've been working with, some of those really significant issues of going into older forests and the risk of doing that versus treating the mid-soil stands. There is a very real economic issue there, though. That's what it basically comes down to in a lot of ways is it'd be great for us to focus on all those mid-soil stands, but can we do that economically, feasibly? Our local communities, local industries geared up for that and so forth. So, do you think it would be possible to use this data to add some kind of economic facet to it so that we can at least, plan projects so that they can be economically feasible, but still, moving down the restoration path?
Ryan, you may want to talk about that. Wasn't some of your work on timber supply in Washington along those lines?
Hey, Tom, this is Chris. Can you hear me on the phone as well?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll take a quick stab at answering that. We did this exact thing kind of in the Illinois Valley for the governor's team in Oregon, looking at what was the ecologically appropriate volume to remove in a restoration treatment, using kind of GNN as the background data for that, and talking about sustainable yield and the volume, and then put it in with some overlay maps based on harvest suitability and things like that. So it's definitely been beta tested and published. We worked with EcoTrust to publish a report on that at a small scale, but if we wanted to kind of take it to the next level, it would require some ecological savvy as a team, but we could definitely do it all the way up to the regional scale. And so this is Ryan. What Tom was mentioning, in Washington, we've been working with the University of Washington and the Department of Natural Resources to take some, again, broad-scale harvesting and management scenario models that had been run out, and using the framework that we're presenting here to look at how have those scenarios, which report on, volume removed, how are they or are they not addressing the restoration needs that we have on the landscape? So that's one use that we've had. And I think you're asking about something slightly different, and honestly, it's really interesting and important is right at the watershed, at the project scale, how to make decisions on restoration needs to meet ecological goals, to have economic feasibility. So they don't have all the answers for that. I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I think as you said, it seems like the data that we have and the work that we've done, at least get some starting points and say if you're coming into a new area, what is the distribution of successional classes, what's out of whack, what are the majority of acres that need to be transitioned, what are some rough guesses about the likely economic value or feasibility of those transitions. I agree they're very important, interesting, and difficult questions to wrestle with.
Yeah, it seems like we don't really I mean, it could lead to how you design your project boundaries so that you're actually thinking about economic feasibility. And it would be great maybe on future presentations, I don't know if others would find it useful, but to talk about some of those analyses you've already done, because it is very real in terms of making restoration, having the capacity to do the restoration. Is half or more of the problem in addition to the ecological need. So, yeah. Thanks.
That's a good point, and we can certainly try to do that. One other thing I wanted to mention, all methods have strengths and weaknesses, and one of the weaknesses of fire regime condition class approach is it's pretty good at structure and not so good at composition. And I've heard repeatedly from folks in the field is that you may have a stand with the desired structure, but it may be full of transfer, which again, depending on your management objectives, may not be a desirable species. So we've come a long way in refining FR60 methods, and I think that might be the next horizon, would be to try to build some composition into it. Again, there's a trade-off in that too, because the more complex you make these models, sometimes the harder they are to understand and the harder they are to implement. But having said that, I think it is a worthy avenue of investigation.
Tom, Clint Emerson has a question. Clint, you want to unmute and ask it?
Oh yeah, thanks. Basically, I was just wondering, how do you compare which edge types, PPS, or biophysical settings within each watershed would be the highest priority? Because when I look at the spreadsheets and I see the breakdown of the data, I see it is done by watershed, but it's broken out by types of treatments, like disturbance or. What about, did you guys break it out by biophysical setting as well? And is that going to be available at all?
In a sense, it's available right now through the Access databases, I think, that are posted or will be posted. But if that's of interest, that is certainly something that we could, I think that we could have in a readily summarized table. I think, Chris and I think maybe we simply didn't do that because it was going to be such an enormous table to put all watersheds and all DPSs into a single table. But, I mean, Chris, we should talk. We can certainly develop a system to make that easily accessible, that data.
Absolutely. I just think it wouldn't fit in the Excel format that we included in our previous appendices. It absolutely is available. I'm not sure how databases will be able to compile them all. And that data is on those Excel data, or on that Access databases that will be going up there. So somebody can plug it and put a query together to distribute that, no problem. Yeah, I think that would be very valuable.
That's exactly the answer I'm looking for.
And I would just put out for anyone on the phone that if you have a specific data question, you'd like to use data from this analysis in a certain way, and you can't figure out how, my, Chris, and Tom's contact info is all on the EcoShare site, so please don't hesitate to ask us, to get a hold of us and say, hey, how can I get, X, Y, Z piece of data out of your analysis? I'd like to use it. Just let us know.
I would caution against getting down to BPSs by Hawk 5 as too prescriptive. I would definitely consider rounding that to thousands of acres. We're looking at CNN data that's been looked at with, reference conditions that are broad percentages, and so this is not silviculture prescriptions again. So if you are looking at it at that fine resolution, really kind of maybe spare your glasses or something, because you don't want to be getting too precise.
Any other questions out there except for the big black dog? I'm not quite sure what he said. All right, I'm not seeing any other come up in the Q&A boxes here, Tom and Ryan. Chris, anything you want to say in closing?
Well, thanks everybody for joining today, and like Ryan said, we're certainly available for follow-up. Ryan?
Yeah, likewise. Thanks everybody for attending, and thanks Tom and his whole team. It's just been a very enjoyable and productive partnership between our teams and organizations, and we look forward to continuing. So, thanks everyone for joining.